Assalamu alaikum. I thought that if we could save time by um, recording the remaining part of the theoretical part of our course. Now, we stopped at discussing whether we read novels to escape from our lives or we read novels in order to explore the human mind. And as we agreed in the classroom, that, well, it depends mainly, but we usually do both. So, in order to explore the concept of fiction a little bit more, um, we said we can't even, limit the definition of fiction because it's fictional based on what? Based on my personal experience. It didn't happen to me. The characters aren't real, they're fictional, but the story itself happened to someone somewhere. So how fictional is it? Now, that's why we say that fiction in general describes something not real, but it's not unreal. It could happen. And the characters, the events may refer to actual people. It could happen, but are still fictional in a way or another. These dialogues did not happen in that particular way, for instance. Now, although we know that such fiction did not exist or did not happen, we know that this story isn't real in the sense that it didn't happen to me as an author. These Zach, Sarah, Michael characters, they are not Zach, Sarah, Michael in real life. But still, we have or we feel something that is real when we read a story about an orphan. Now, this orphan may not exist. This orphan may not be alive. This orphan may be a fictional character. But as a reader, I connect, I identify with this character, and I feel sorry for him or for her. And I sympathize with them. And that again makes us ask a very important question about novels in particular and literature in general. What kind of emotions are produced when we read or while reading? And one of the things we mentioned during the class, we said, what if I'm reading a story about a serial killer, but the way that this serial killer is presented makes us sympathize with him? For example, we are shown a childhood that is filled with rage, a childhood that is filled with violence. And again, we sympathize with the idea that this child was brought up in a very bad environment, which made him become a serial killer. So am I feeling sorry for that serial killer now? That's the question. And that's why we said literature can be dangerous. It can make us sympathize with people we wouldn't, or characters we wouldn't usually sympathize with in real life, especially if we are directly affected in real life by these people. Now, let's skip this one. Okay. Fiction versus nonfiction. Before we go into the concept of fiction and nonfiction, let's first stress the difference between what a story is and what the plot is. A story is like the summary of what happened in the novel. Something like, what's the story of this book? And it takes a few seconds to explain, but the plot is about the events that take place, the arrangement of the events, and how the events are connected. And we have plots, we have subplots, we have episodic plots, and it takes more time to explain, and the plot is what drives the story. So basically, it's what leads the characters towards a certain path, a certain uh, direction, and so on. Now, regarding narratives or fictional narratives or novels in general, they allow us, or they first allow the writers to enter the mind of the characters, and it also allows the reader to go into the different um like the different mentalities of people, because I could read a novel that includes a good person and a bad person, a child, a woman, a man, and while reading these stories or their stories, we start exploring the mentality of the black slave, or the white master, or the bad thief, or the good thief, or the bad murderer, or the good murderer, and so on. So it allows us to explore the minds of different characters. And then the question again, um, am I looking at how these characters would think in real life, or am I just looking through the eyes of the author who invented these characters? Again, that's a very difficult question to answer. Um, Now, sometimes we confuse the narrator of a novel with the author of the novel. Um, I am a woman, and I can write a novel whose narrator is a man. And this man does not necessarily represent me as an author. Okay. Uh, However, if I write a scientific book about translation or literature or whatever, we call it a nonfiction. And if I ever in the book refer to myself with I most, or generally, I refer to myself as a Nour. But in novels, the narrator who says I, or the character that says I, does not necessarily have to be the author himself or herself. So we need to keep this in mind. That's why we usually use the word persona to refer to the character that may voice the narrator, which is not necessarily the writer. And this usually happens in poetry. If there is a poem and the poem uses first person narration, we say that it's a persona, a character, not the poet himself or herself. What elements must a literary work contain to be considered a novel? And does the answer change as the novel changes? Exactly as we said, that the concept or the term a novel is difficult to limit into one definition. We can also say that the characteristics that make a novel are also difficult to limit. But generally speaking, novels are usually written in prose, but we also said that they can include poetry, and they include characters. Sometimes we said in stream of consciousness, for example, you don't need characters. It could be just one person telling the story. It could be just descriptive. Uh, it could also be based on real life people. It usually narrates a longer story through plots and subplots. And this is the main difference between a novel and a story or a short story. Short stories focus on a shorter number of events, a smaller number of characters, usually limited to certain events in time. They can include a long duration, stories can include long durations, but at the end of the day, um, there's like one plot that is immediately served by the characters and the dialogues. And in novels, a plot can begin in the beginning of the novel and can come to the end or the resolution after 200 pages or 300 or more. Novels, like stories, don't necessarily follow a chronological order. We could start, the first chapter could be in the future, and the second in the past, and then it moves to the future again, then the present, then the past, then the future. So it doesn't have to follow a strict timeline. It can include dialogue, and like I don't want to say should include dialogue, but there are different types of readers. Some readers enjoy descriptive novels, novels that do not focus on dialogue, and like Charles Dickens novels, but other people enjoy the dialogues, enjoy how these dialogues how these dialogues move the plot forward, help develop the characters, and so on. And it should include conflict. A conflict is not necessarily a fight, it's not necessarily a dispute. The concept of a conflict is that having two ideas that oppose each other, having two powers that come against each other, having a protagonist and an antagonist, having two people saying different things. Let's say for breakfast, I want to have boiled eggs. My sister wants to have fried eggs. That's conflict. And we can say that the characters or the dialogue moves the plot forward, but other elements don't, because conflict also helps develop the characters. The plot helps develop the story. And all of these elements function together at the same time in order to move the story forward. And it's a lot like life, you know? If you live alone without anyone in your life, there is no conflict, there is no story, there's no um, plot that moves you forward. But once you interact with people, the plot happens, the conflict arises, and so on. So let's go through this one. We took one in the classroom and it started happy, ended sad. Let's read this one together. Stacy, who had just turned 19, is going through difficult times at her university after her grandmother had passed away. Now, who's Stacy? Stacy is a fictional character, but anyone can be Stacy, right? We all turn 19 at some point. We all go through difficult times at the university. And some of us have lost a parent, a grandparent. So, although this statement is fictional, it's not real, but it's still realistic. It still can happen. Although Stacy is not a real character, she's a fictional character, I, as a reader, start to sympathize with her, start to connect with her, especially that I'm a university student who's around 19. She's been trying to follow up with the work she missed, but everything seems to fall apart. Again, these feelings, we share these feelings as readers. We feel for Stacy. After a long walk and deep talk with her friend Emily, she decided to move past her grief and double her efforts. So now my emotions start to go towards a positive direction, right? It started bad. She's going through some hard time. Now her character is developing. She is learning to live with grief. She's learning to accept grief. And she decides to change her attitude towards the university work and university life. She understood that life was moving too fast, and she either gets on the train and reaches her destination or loses hope and falls out. She decided to be brave and strong. Now, after reading this very short story that is filled with events, that is filled with um, uh, let's say, um, emotions, we as characters feel connected. Although we don't know who Stacy is, we don't even know her last name, we don't know what she's studying, which university she's studying at, we don't know her grandmother, we don't know anything, but we still feel that we identify with her. We share her grief. We've been through something similar. We're still struggling with the university. And that is why we say that literature does affect us, whether we like it or not. It makes us feel something. It makes us sympathize with characters that are fictional, characters that are not real, stories that are not necessarily very real. So, can reading a novel change your life? Personally, yes, it can. Sometimes a novel can help us move past our fears. Sometimes a novel can make us see the world from a different angle. And sometimes a novel can make us become bad. We start having bad attitude. We start doing like these characters, thinking that these characters are real. And when we start thinking about reality, we start losing, um, let's say, we stop distinguishing what is real from fictional. We start expecting from people to do things the way the characters in the novel did. We start to expect certain results from actions that we witnessed in a certain novel. That's why we again say that literature is dangerous, and it is a double-edged sword. And we should be very careful with what we read and be very selective, because who knows which novel can change us, and to what extent such change can affect our lives, whether in a good or a bad